Welcome to my philosophy channel. In 399 before the Common Era, a 70-year-old man drank poison in an Athenian prison. He had been found guilty by 500 ordinary citizens, not for violence, not for theft, but for asking questions. His student, a young man named Plato, would spend the next 50 years trying to build a world where that verdict could never be repeated. He failed. But the attempt became the foundation of everything the West calls thinking. This video runs a little long. If you stay with me to the end, you might understand not just what Plato believed, but why you have never stopped thinking inside the architecture he built. Chapter 1. The Wound That Built a World. Athens, spring of 399 before the Common Era. The trial lasted less than a day. 500 citizens, farmers, potters, merchants, men who had never read a line of philosophy, sat in judgment over a stonemason's son who had spent 4 decades doing one thing: walking up to powerful people and asking whether they actually understood the words they used. The formal charge was impiety and corrupting the youth. The real offense was making confident men feel uncertain. The verdict came back guilty, by a margin of roughly 60 votes. When invited to propose his own punishment, Socrates suggested the city reward him with free meals at public expense for life, the honor reserved for Olympic champions. The jury, humiliated, chose death instead. He accepted the sentence with the composure of someone who had expected nothing else. A month later, surrounded by weeping friends, he drank the hemlock. His legs went numb first, then his chest, then silence. Somewhere nearby stood a 28-year-old named Aristocles, broad enough in the shoulders that people called him Plato. He had studied under Socrates for a decade. He was absent from the prison cell on the final day. Illness kept him away, or perhaps something harder to name. But the death entered him the way certain losses do, not as grief alone, but as a question that replaces all other questions. Everything he wrote afterward was shaped by that absence. The question was not abstract. How does the most intellectually advanced city on earth, the city that built the Parthenon, invented democratic assembly, staged the tragedies of Sophocles, how does that city put its wisest man on trial and vote to kill him? Not through tyranny, not through a coup, through procedure, through counted ballots and legal process, through 500 citizens doing exactly what democracy asked them to do. To understand why Plato never forgave this, you need to see the Athens he lived in. The Peloponnesian War, 27 years of catastrophe, had ended just 5 years earlier in total defeat. Sparta occupied the city. A junta called the 30 Tyrants seized power and murdered over 1,000 citizens in 8 months. When democracy was restored, it returned wounded, paranoid, and hungry for someone to blame. The city needed a scapegoat dressed in respectability. Socrates fit the role. He had associated with members of the 30, including Critias, one of the most violent. He had spent years questioning democratic assumptions in public, pointing out that Athens would never choose a ship's captain by lottery, yet chose its rulers that way. He had taught young aristocrats to doubt their fathers and cross-examine their elders. In a city desperate to rebuild its confidence, a man who made questioning a way of life looked indistinguishable from a man trying to tear everything down. Plato watched all of this unfold. He watched the democracy he had been raised to trust execute the one person he believed to be genuinely good, and do so by following its own rules. The mob did not storm the prison. No dictator signed the order. Citizens raised their hands. Clerks tallied the count, and a man died because the majority said he should. This was not lawlessness. This was law. and that made it worse than any tyranny Plato could imagine. The experience gave him more than grief. It gave him a diagnosis. He concluded that the root sickness was not corrupt leaders or broken institutions, but something deeper: ignorance wearing the mask of knowledge. The 500 jurors believed they understood piety, corruption, what was good for the city. They did not. They had opinions, loud, confident, politically convenient opinions, and they could not tell the difference between those opinions and genuine understanding. The gap between what people think they know and what they actually know became the obsession of his life. He could have responded with retreat. Many of his contemporaries did, withdrawing into private life, cultivating gardens, avoiding politics entirely. Plato chose the opposite. Around 387 BCE, he founded the academy on the outskirts of Athens, the first permanent institution of higher learning in the Western world. It would operate continuously for over 900 years. He wrote more than 30 dialogues, placing Socrates at their center, giving his dead teacher an afterlife in argument that has now outlasted every building in Athens. And he constructed, piece by piece, a philosophical system designed to answer the question the trial had burned into him. The theory of forms, the claim that a perfect, unchanging reality exists behind the chaos of appearances. The architecture of the just city, where knowledge, not popularity, determines who rules. The divided line of human cognition, separating genuine understanding from the confident ignorance that killed his teacher. Every major idea Plato ever had traces back to a courtroom where 500 men confused their prejudices with truth. Some thinkers arrive at philosophy through curiosity. Plato arrived through damage, and the scar tissue became the most influential body of thought the Western world has ever produced. Chapter 2. The Cave and its Prisoners. Imagine a row of human beings who have never seen daylight. They sit chained in a long underground chamber, their necks and wrists fixed so they can only look forward at the stone wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire burns on a raised platform. Between the fire and the prisoners runs a low wall, and along that wall, unseen figures carry objects: carved animals, wooden trees, clay pots, whose shadows fall across the stone surface the prisoners face. This is all they have ever seen. This is all they believe exists. They give the shadows names. They study their patterns. They compete to predict which shadow will appear next, and the ones who predict best are honored as the wisest among them. Their entire civilization, language, status, meaning, is built on shadows. And none of them suspects that what they are watching is not reality, but a projection of something they have never been allowed to turn around and face. This is Plato's allegory of the cave, the single most famous image in the history of Western philosophy. It appears in Book 7 of the Republic, and when you first encounter it, it reads like a parable about ignorance. But sit with it longer, and it becomes something more uncomfortable. It is not a story about people who lack information. It is a story about people who are certain they already have enough. The chained prisoners are not stupid. They are experts. They have built an entire system of knowledge around the movement of shadows. Categories, predictions, hierarchies of competence. Within the terms of their world, they function brilliantly. The chains are not the real prison. The real prison is the fact that their expertise makes them confident, and their confidence makes them incapable of imagining they might be wrong. Plato understood something about human cognition that modern psychology would take 23 centuries to formalize. The more skilled we become within a closed system, the less capable we are of seeing that the system itself might be a cage. Then something breaks the pattern. One prisoner is unchained. Plato does not say who frees them or why. The act appears almost arbitrary, a disruption without warning. And the freed prisoner does not feel liberated. They feel pain. The fire behind them, a light source they have never faced, burns their eyes. The objects casting shadows seem less real, not more. Because the prisoner has spent a lifetime learning to read shadows with precision and has no practice reading objects. Every instinct says, turn back. The familiar darkness is easier. The shadows made sense. This new brightness is just confusion. Plato describes the ascent out of the cave as forced. The freed prisoner is dragged up a steep and rough passage toward the mouth of the cave. This is not a gentle awakening. It is violent. The prisoner resists. Their eyes water and sting. When they finally emerge into open air, the sunlight is so overwhelming that, for a long time, they can see nothing at all. They can only look at reflections in water, then at shadows cast by real objects under the sun, then at the objects themselves, and only after prolonged adjustment can they look at the sun directly, the source of everything visible. Each stage corresponds to a level of understanding. The shadows on the cave wall are images and illusions, the lowest form of cognition. The fire inside the cave represents the material world's limited light, better than shadows, but still enclosed. The objects outside the cave are the forms, the eternal structures behind appearances. And the sun is what Plato calls the form of the good, the principle that makes all other truth intelligible, the way sunlight makes all objects visible. To see the sun is to understand why anything is true at all. But here the allegory turns from epistemology to tragedy. Suppose the freed prisoner, having adjusted to sunlight, having seen the world as it actually is, decides to return to the cave. Not out of desire, who would choose darkness after seeing light, but out of obligation, out of the thought that the others deserve to know. They descend back into the underground chamber. Their eyes, adapted to daylight, cannot function in the dark. They stumble. They cannot identify the shadows the other prisoners read with ease. They look to the chained experts like a fool who went up and came back ruined. When this returned prisoner tries to explain that the shadows are not real, that there is a world above filled with color and dimension, and a source of light beyond imagination, the prisoners do not believe them. They do not even consider the possibility. Why would they? Their system works. Their predictions hold. Their status depends on mastery of the wall. The messenger from above is not offering them freedom. The messenger is threatening everything they have built. And if this messenger tries to unchain them, to force them up the passage, Plato says the prisoners would kill them if they could. He is thinking of Socrates, the man who returned to the cave of Athenian opinion and tried to drag people toward the light of examined truth. The city did not thank him, it executed him. The allegory is autobiography encrypted in metaphor. But the cave has not stayed in ancient Athens. Walk into any modern living room where a screen glows against a darkened wall, feeding a stream of images curated by algorithms designed to confirm what the viewer already believes. And you are looking at something Plato would have recognized immediately. The chains are no longer iron. They are convenience, preference, the gentle friction of a feed that never challenges. Each user sits in a personalized cave, watching shadows tailored to feel like truth, competing for status within a closed system, and resisting, sometimes with real hostility, anyone who suggests that the wall they are watching is not the whole world. The allegory does not flatter anyone. It does not say most people are in the cave, and you, the listener, are outside. It says the default human condition is imprisonment, that freedom is rare and painful, that the path toward genuine understanding requires giving up comforts you did not even know were comforts. And it says something darker still, that those who make the passage and return to help will likely be hated for it. Truth is not popular, it never has been. The cave is warm, and the light outside is blinding. Plato never promised that leaving the cave would make you happy. He only promised it would make you see. Chapter 3. The World Behind the World. A wooden chair sits in a carpenter's workshop. A metal chair stands on a restaurant patio. A plastic chair leans against a classroom wall. They share no material, no color, no weight. One was shaped by hand, another pressed by machine, another molded in a factory across an ocean. Yet a child of 3, who has never been taught the word, can point to all 3 and recognize them as the same kind of thing. How? If there is no single physical property common to every chair that has ever existed, what exactly is the mind recognizing? This question, quiet, almost innocent, is the doorway to the most radical metaphysical claim in Western philosophy. Plato's answer was not that we learn categories through experience, not that we abstract common features from many examples, but that beyond this physical world there exists another realm entirely. A realm of perfect, eternal, unchanging structures he called forms, or ideas. The wooden chair, the metal chair, the plastic chair. Each is an imperfect copy, a flickering approximation of a perfect form of chair that exists outside time and space, never built, never broken, never altered. This sounds at first hearing like mysticism, but Plato reached it through argument, not revelation. Consider mathematics, a discipline he loved deeply enough to inscribe above the academy's door. Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. When you think of a perfect circle, you are not thinking of any circle you have ever drawn or seen. Every physical circle is slightly imperfect, a tremor of the hand, a flaw in the compass, a wobble in the surface. Yet you understand perfect circularity with absolute precision. You can prove theorems about it. You can calculate its area to infinite decimal places. The object of your understanding is not any physical thing. It is something your mind grasps through reason alone. Something that would remain true even if every drawn circle in the universe were erased. Plato would say you are accessing the form of circle, not a mental image, not a useful fiction, but a real entity, more real, in fact, than any circle you could draw. The drawn circles decay, smudge, disappear. The mathematical circle is eternal. The copies come and go. The original endures. And this applies not only to geometry, but to everything. There is a form of beauty itself, not the beauty of this face or that sunset, but beauty as such, the standard against which all beautiful things are measured and found wanting. There is a form of justice itself, not the justice of this law or that verdict, but the unchanging principle that every just act imperfectly reflects. At the summit of this hierarchy stands what Plato called the form of the good. It is to the intelligible world what the sun is to the visible world, the source not only of truth, but of the very capacity to understand truth. Without the good, no other form can be fully grasped, just as without sunlight, no object can be fully seen. Plato is frustratingly vague about what the good actually is. He approaches it only through analogy, never through direct definition. Scholars have argued for centuries whether it is moral perfection, metaphysical unity, or something beyond language altogether. The vagueness may be deliberate. Perhaps the highest truth resists the kind of packaging that lower truths permit. The ethical stakes of this theory are enormous. If justice itself exists as an eternal form, then justice is not whatever a society happens to call just. Slavery was not acceptable just because Athens accepted it. Genocide is not permissible just because a regime legalizes it. There is an objective standard, independent of culture, independent of opinion, independent of power, against which every human action and every human institution can be measured. Plato becomes, through this theory, one of the most forceful defenders of moral objectivism in the history of thought. Moral progress is real. Moral error is real. And both can be identified by anyone willing to reason their way past the comfortable illusions of their own culture. But the theory carries a strange corollary that Plato embraced without flinching. If the forms are the truly real, then everything you can touch is less real than something you can only think. The table in front of you, the hand resting on it, the weight of your body in the chair, all of this belongs to the realm of becoming, the domain of things that change, decay, and eventually cease to exist. It is not fully real. It is a shadow cast by something permanent onto something temporary. Plato looked at the entire physical universe and called it an imperfect copy. The audacity of this claim has never been equaled. And yet the theory begins to crack under pressure almost as soon as it is stated. The most devastating critique came not from an enemy, but from Plato's own student. Aristotle posed what philosophers call the third man argument. If individual humans resemble the form of human, and this resemblance must be explained by a further form that both the individuals and the first form participate in, then we need another form to explain that resemblance, and another, and so on into infinity. The theory that was supposed to ground all explanation becomes an infinite regress that explains nothing. There is also the participation problem, a difficulty so stubborn that no Platonist has ever fully resolved it. How, exactly, do physical things relate to forms? Plato used metaphors. Particular things imitate forms. They participate in forms. They resemble forms. But these are only metaphors. What is the actual mechanism? If a form is completely separate from the physical world, it seems unable to influence physical things at all. If it is not completely separate, then it becomes just another thing in the world, losing the eternity and perfection that made it explanatory in the first place. The bridge between the two realms, the very connection that makes the theory useful, turns out to be the part Plato cannot build. He knew this. In his later dialogue, the Parmenides, a text we will return to, Plato staged a scene where an elderly philosopher dismantles the theory of forms using arguments so sharp they draw blood. He also raised what scholars call the problem of garbage forms. If every category of thing has a corresponding eternal form, is there a form of mud, a form of hair, a form of disease? It seems absurd that ugliness and triviality should have perfect eternal archetypes. But if forms only exist for noble and important things, the theory loses its power to explain how we categorize anything at all. Despite these fractures, the theory has proven astonishingly productive. Contemporary mathematicians routinely speak as if mathematical objects exist independently of human minds. When a proof demonstrates that there are infinitely many prime numbers, the proof is discovering something, not inventing it. The primes were there before the proof, and would remain if every mathematician vanished. This is mathematical Platonism, and it is the working philosophy of a significant portion of the mathematical community. In cognitive science, the concept of prototypes, idealized mental representations against which we compare new instances, echoes the structure of Plato's forms without requiring his metaphysics. Even in physics, the laws of nature, mathematical equations that govern everything from falling apples to collapsing stars, seem to exist independently of the physical universe they describe. Gravity did not begin when Newton wrote his equation. It was there all along, waiting to be recognized. The theory of forms is, in the end, a magnificent ruin. Its walls still stand high enough to shelter real insight about the objectivity of mathematics, the reality of moral truth, the power of abstract thought to reach beyond the senses. But its foundations are cracked, and the cracks have never been repaired. Plato saw something genuine, that the mind can grasp truths no eye will ever see, that some realities persist long after every physical instance has perished. His explanation of how this is possible, a separate realm of perfect eternal structures, was the boldest answer anyone has ever offered. That it was also, in important ways, the wrong answer does not diminish its power. Sometimes the questions a theory fails to answer matter more than the questions it resolves. The forms still haunt philosophy. Every time someone insists that 2 + 2 = 4 regardless of what anyone believes, every time someone argues that slavery was wrong even when entire civilizations accepted it, every time a scientist discovers a law that was true before any mind existed to think it, Plato's ghost stirs. We may not live in his world, but we have never found a way to live entirely outside it. Chapter 4. What can we really know? You believe the earth is round. So does the person sitting next to you on the train. But ask yourself, honestly, whether you could prove it right now, without a phone, without a textbook, using only your own reasoning and direct experience. Most of us believe the earth is round because someone told us, because we saw photographs, because the claim was repeated so often it became furniture in our minds. We hold a true belief, but do we understand why it is true? Could we defend it against a clever skeptic? Plato would say there is a difference between these two states, a difference that matters more than almost anything else in human life. In the Republic, he draws a diagram that has haunted epistemology ever since. A single vertical line, divided into 2 unequal segments, each segment divided again. The lower half represents the visible world, everything you can see and touch. The upper half represents the intelligible world, everything you can only grasp through thought. Each half splits further into 2 levels, giving 4 stages of cognition arranged from lowest to highest. The structure is deceptively simple. Its implications are severe. The lowest level Plato calls imagination or conjecture. This is the realm of images, reflections, shadows, artistic representations. A painting of a horse, a photograph of a mountain, a political slogan repeated until it feels like wisdom. At this level, we mistake representations for the things they represent. We confuse the image with the reality behind it. Most people, Plato thought, spend most of their lives here, not because they are unintelligent, but because images are easier to process than the complex realities they depict. A headline is simpler than the event. A caricature is more memorable than a person. The second level is belief or conviction. Here we deal with actual physical objects, real horses, real mountains, real political situations. This is better than mistaking images for reality, but it still falls short of genuine knowledge. Physical things change constantly. The horse ages and dies. The mountain erodes. The political situation shifts with every election. You can have a correct belief about these things, but correctness alone does not make it knowledge. You believe your car is parked where you left it. You are probably right. But this belief rests on perception and memory, both fallible, both tied to a world that never stops moving beneath your feet. The third level marks entry into something different. Here we encounter mathematical and logical reasoning. The realm of the geometer, the astronomer, the theorist working with abstract structures. 2 plus 2 equals 4. The angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees. These truths do not depend on observation. They do not decay. They were true before any human existed, and will remain true after the last mind goes dark. Plato respected this level deeply. It was why he required a decade of mathematical training before philosophy could begin. But he saw a limitation even here. Mathematicians start with axioms they accept without proving. They reason forward from assumptions, deriving consequences with perfect logic, but they never examine the ground they stand on. They know that their conclusions follow from their premises. They do not know why the premises themselves are true. The highest level belongs to the philosopher. Through dialectic, the method of systematic questioning that traces every assumption back to its foundation, the philosopher reaches what Plato calls the unhypothetical first principle. This is the form of the good, the ground of all truth, the source that makes everything else intelligible. At this level, the knower understands not merely that something is true, but why it must be true, how it connects to every other truth, how it flows from the single principle that holds reality together. This is episteme, genuine knowledge. Everything below it, however useful, however correct, is doxa, mere opinion. The distinction sounds academic until you feel its edge. Plato is saying that almost everything you believe you know, you do not actually know. Your beliefs about history, about other people, about what happened yesterday and what will happen tomorrow, all of it falls short of knowledge. You hold opinions, some true, some false, most untested. The doctor diagnosing your illness operates at the level of informed belief, not knowledge, because the diagnosis concerns a particular body in a particular moment, the domain of change, not of eternity. True knowledge, in Plato's framework, is rare enough to be almost unreachable. It belongs only to those who turn their entire being away from the shifting physical world and toward the permanent structures of reason. There is something bracing about this severity. It strips away the comfortable assumption that because we have information, we have understanding. Every age flatters itself that it knows more than the last. We have data now, terabytes of it, more than any civilization in history. But data is not comprehension. A person can drown in facts and never once grasp why any of them are true. Plato would look at our information age and see the lowest level of his divided line. A civilization of images mistaking volume for depth, confusing the number of shadows on the wall with knowledge of what casts them. But the theory has a dark side that Plato did not flinch from. He walked straight into it. If genuine knowledge is this rare, accessible only through decades of philosophical training, then most human beings are permanently confined to the realm of opinion. They cannot know. They can only believe, more or less correctly, guided by those who do know. This creates a natural hierarchy. The knowers at the top, the opinion holders below. The philosopher rules not by force but by epistemic right. The way a doctor prescribes not because of social rank, but because of understanding that the patient lacks. The authoritarian implications are obvious. If ordinary people cannot distinguish knowledge from opinion, how can they govern themselves? How can they choose leaders, set policy, decide matters of war and peace? They will inevitably be swayed by demagogues who sound confident, by rhetoric that feels true, by prejudices dressed in the language of common sense. Plato saw the trial of Socrates as proof. 500 citizens, certain of their own judgment, voted to kill the one man in Athens who actually understood the difference between wisdom and its imitation. Yet the epistemology creates a problem it cannot solve. If only philosophers possess genuine knowledge, how do non-philosophers recognize a genuine philosopher when one appears? The person who lacks knowledge, by definition, cannot evaluate claims to knowledge. A society of opinion holders has no reliable method for identifying the one person who sees clearly. History confirms the difficulty. Countless rulers, priests, and intellectuals have claimed special access to truth. Some were wise, many were charlatans. Without a way for ordinary people to tell the difference, Plato's system offers no protection against the very tyranny it was designed to prevent. The philosopher king and the confident fraud look identical to those standing below them. Modern epistemology has largely rejected Plato's sharp division. Knowledge, most contemporary philosophers agree, does not require access to eternal forms. Justified true belief, believing something that is true, for good reasons, is sufficient. You can know that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius if you have observed it, understand why, and your belief is correct. This makes knowledge more achievable and more relevant to the lives people actually live. Plato's austere conception, however beautiful in its ambition, seems to evacuate knowledge of practical meaning. But dismiss him too quickly and you lose something real. He was right that there is a difference between holding a true belief and understanding why it is true. The student who memorizes that the Pythagorean theorem works and the student who grasps the proof inhabit different intellectual worlds, even if both can pass the same exam. He was right that some knowledge appears independent of experience. Mathematical truths seem knowable through reason alone, without observing any physical triangle or counting any physical set. And he was right that cognition comes in degrees, that we can think more or less deeply about the same subject, that understanding a principle is not the same as reciting it. Educational systems around the world implicitly accept this when they distinguish memorization from comprehension, facts from insight. In an age when confident assertion floods every platform, when the loudest voice passes for the most authoritative, when expertise is dismissed as elitism and opinion elevated to the status of truth, Plato's central question cuts as deep as it ever did. How do you tell the difference between someone who knows and someone who merely believes they know? Between the doctor and the quack, the scientist and the conspiracy theorist, the leader with genuine understanding and the demagogue with a gift for sounding certain? Plato may have gotten the answer wrong. But the question remains the most urgent one any society can ask, and we are no closer to solving it than Athens was on the day it sentenced its wisest citizen to death. Chapter 5. The Architecture of the Soul. It is 3 in the morning. You have a meeting at 8. You know, with the clarity of settled conviction, that you should put the phone down and sleep. And yet your thumb keeps scrolling, pulled by something that does not care about your meeting, does not respect your reasoning, does not even seem to be you in any meaningful sense. There is a war happening inside your chest, and the side that knows better is losing. Plato would not have been surprised. He built an entire psychology around the suspicion that you are not one person but 3. In the Republic, he divides the soul into 3 distinct parts, each with its own desires, its own pleasures, its own way of seeing the world. The rational part, the logistikon, seeks truth and understanding. It calculates, weighs evidence, considers consequences. It is the part of you that knows you should sleep. The spirited part, the thumoides, seeks honor, recognition, and victory. It is the source of anger and ambition, the force that makes you stand up when insulted, push harder when challenged, feel shame when you fail to meet your own standards. And the appetitive part, the epithemedikon, seeks pleasure, food, drink, sex, comfort, material accumulation. It is the part that wants to keep scrolling, not because it has reasons, but because the stimulus feels good and stopping feels like loss. Each part has its proper virtue. Wisdom belongs to reason. Courage belongs to spirit. Moderation belongs to appetite, not the elimination of desire, but its willingness to be governed. And justice, the virtue Plato cares about most, is not located in any single part. Justice is the relationship between them. A just soul is one where reason rules, spirit supports reason's authority, and appetite obeys without rebellion. An unjust soul is one where the hierarchy collapses, where appetite seizes control and drags reason behind it like a prisoner, or where spirit, swollen with pride, refuses to listen to anything except its own hunger for dominance. Plato illustrates this with an image that has the texture of a dream. In the Phaedrus, he compares the soul to a charioteer driving two winged horses. One horse is white, noble, obedient. It represents spirit, responsive to the reins, eager to rise. The other horse is dark, wild, and nearly uncontrollable. It represents appetite, pulling the chariot downward toward the earth, toward physical pleasures, toward everything that is immediate and heavy. The charioteer is reason, struggling to keep both horses moving in the same direction. Upward toward the forms, toward truth, toward the light the soul dimly remembers from before it was born into a body. The image captures something about inner life that 2,400 years of psychology have not improved upon. We do experience ourselves as divided. The sensation of wanting something while simultaneously knowing it is bad for you is not a failure of willpower in some simple sense. It is a conflict between systems that genuinely want different things. Your appetite does not miscalculate. It is not making an error that reason could correct with better data. It simply does not care about your long-term interests. It operates on a different timescale, with different values toward different ends. Reason and appetite are not the same faculty reaching different conclusions. They are different faculties with different goals, yoked together in a single body. Modern psychology has arrived at remarkably similar structures through entirely different methods. The distinction between fast, automatic, emotionally driven cognition and slow, deliberate, rational cognition, what Daniel Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2, maps loosely but recognizably onto Plato's division. Freud's id, ego, and superego, whatever their clinical limitations, reflect the same basic architecture: a part that wants, a part that judges, and a part that mediates between them. Evolutionary psychology tells us that our brains are layered. Ancient drives overlaid with more recent capacities for abstract reasoning, each layer pursuing its own evolutionary agenda. Plato did not have neuroscience. He had introspection, dialogue, and a gift for noticing what most people prefer to ignore. But the soul, for Plato, is not merely a psychological model. It is a metaphysical entity, immortal, incorporeal, belonging fundamentally to the realm of forms rather than to the physical world. The body is a temporary container, even a prison. The soul existed before birth, directly apprehending the forms in a disembodied state. When it enters a body, it forgets what it knew. Education is the process of remembering. Philosophy is the practice of dying, not in any morbid sense, but as a discipline of detaching from bodily concerns and redirecting attention toward eternal truths. The philosopher trains the soul to live as if the body were already gone. In the Phaedo, the dialogue set in Socrates' prison cell on his final day, Plato offers 4 arguments for the soul's immortality. Life comes from death and death from life. in an eternal cycle that requires the soul to persist between bodies. We possess knowledge of perfect equality and perfect beauty that no physical experience could have given us. So the soul must have learned these truths before birth. The soul is simple and uncomposite, so it cannot break apart the way physical objects do, and life is essential to the soul's nature. Just as heat is essential to fire, so the soul cannot admit death without ceasing to be what it is. These arguments may have been persuasive in the 4th century before the Common Era. They are difficult to sustain now. Neuroscience has demonstrated that every aspect of mental life, memory, personality, emotion, the capacity for reason itself, depends on physical brain processes. Damage specific regions of the brain and specific capacities disappear. Alter the brain's chemistry and consciousness transforms. When the brain dies, there is no evidence that anything continues. The soul, as Plato described it, an independent, immortal substance that inhabits the body temporarily, appears to be a beautiful hypothesis, contradicted by everything we have learned about how minds actually work. There is also an internal contradiction Plato never fully resolved. In the Phaedo, the soul is simple and without parts, a requirement for its immortality, since only composite things can decompose. But in the Republic, the soul has 3 parts, each capable of conflicting with the others. A thing with 3 parts is not simple. If the soul is composite, it can, in principle, come apart. Plato may have recognized this tension. In later dialogues, he seems to suggest that only the rational part of the soul is truly immortal, while the spirited and appetitive parts perish with the body. But this raises its own difficulty. If 2/3 of your psychological life dies when your body dies, what survives is not you in any recognizable sense. It is a fragment, the capacity for abstract thought, stripped of desire, ambition, emotion, everything that made you a particular person. Yet something in Plato's vision refuses to die, even after its metaphysical scaffolding has been removed. We do experience ourselves as more than biological machinery. The felt sense of being a subject, of having an interior life, of being someone to whom things matter, does not reduce neatly to neural firing patterns, however much those patterns may underlie it. Plato was wrong that the soul is an independent substance. He may not have been wrong that understanding a human being requires more than describing the physics of their brain. The question of what consciousness is, how subjective experience arises from objective matter, remains one of the hardest problems in philosophy and science. It is, in a sense, Plato's question restated in modern vocabulary. The practical core of his psychology, meanwhile, has outlived its metaphysics entirely. The idea that a healthy mind requires the right relationship between reason, emotion, and desire, that psychological well-being is a matter of internal order rather than external circumstance, runs through every major tradition of therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches patients to identify when irrational desires or distorted emotional responses are overriding rational judgment. Dialectical behavior therapy trains people to regulate the spirited part of the soul, the part that reacts with intense emotion, so that reason can reassert control. The language is modern. The architecture is Plato's. And his most unsettling claim may be his truest. The tyrant, the person who has surrendered entirely to appetite, who satisfies every desire without restraint, is not free. The tyrant is the most enslaved person alive, chained to cravings that multiply faster than they can be satisfied, unable to trust, unable to love, unable to rest. Freedom is not the absence of constraint. Freedom is the proper ordering of the soul. You are free when reason governs, not when appetite runs unchecked. 2,400 years later, in an economy built on the stimulation and satisfaction of desires, that claim still has the power to make you pause at 3 in the morning, phone in hand, and wonder which part of you is really in charge. Chapter 6. Justice and the Tyrant's Ring. A shepherd is tending his flock on a hillside in Lydia when the ground splits open after an earthquake. He climbs down into the fissure and finds, among other wonders, a hollow bronze horse containing the skeleton of a man larger than any human. On the dead man's hand is a gold ring. The shepherd takes it. Days later, sitting among other shepherds, he discovers by accident that turning the ring's setting inward makes him invisible. He tests it again. Visible, invisible, visible. Within weeks, he has used the ring to seduce the queen, murder the king, and seize the throne. No one stopped him because no one could see him. This is the story of the Ring of Gyges, told by Glaucon near the beginning of Plato's Republic. But Glaucon is not telling it as a fable. He is telling it as a challenge, the most dangerous challenge Plato ever faced. Suppose you had this ring. Suppose you could do anything without consequence, without detection, without punishment. Would you still be just? Glaucon suspects the answer is no. He suspects that every human being, given true invisibility, would behave exactly as the shepherd did. We are just only because we are watched. Remove the audience and the performance ends. The challenge strikes deeper than it first appears. Glaucon is not asking whether people happen to behave badly when unsupervised. He is asking whether justice has any value at all beyond its social utility. If justice is only valuable because it protects us from punishment and earns us reputation, then it is not really a virtue, it is a calculation. The truly rational person would maintain the appearance of justice, enough to keep neighbors trusting and courts uninterested, while privately pursuing every advantage. Justice becomes a mask that self-interest wears in public. This was not Glaucon's idea alone. Earlier in the dialogue, a fiercer voice had already laid the groundwork. Thrasymachus, a real historical figure, a rhetorician with a reputation for verbal violence, erupts into the conversation like a man who has been holding his tongue too long. Justice, he declares, is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. Rulers make laws that serve their own interests and call those laws just. Citizens obey because they fear punishment, not because the laws are genuinely right. The entire apparatus of morality is a confidence trick run by the powerful against the weak. The truly intelligent person sees through it, plays the game without believing in it, and takes whatever they can get. Thrasymachus is not a straw man. His position has been restated in every century since, by Machiavelli, by Nietzsche, by every realist who argues that power is the only thing that matters and morality is merely its disguise. The position cannot be dismissed with a wave. It must be defeated with argument, or the entire project of moral philosophy collapses. Plato knew this. The Republic exists because he took Thrasymachus and Glaucon seriously enough to build a 300-page answer. His strategy is indirect and architecturally ambitious. Rather than defining justice in the individual soul directly, he proposes examining justice in something larger and easier to see: the city. A city comes into being, Plato argues, because no person is self-sufficient. We need farmers to grow food, builders to make shelter, soldiers to provide protection, and someone to coordinate the whole. Natural differences in ability sort people into roles. Some are suited to produce goods. Some have the courage and physical capacity to defend the city. And a few, very few, possess the wisdom and temperament to govern. 3 classes emerge: producers, guardians, and rulers. Each class has a corresponding virtue. Producers need moderation, the willingness to accept their role and not grasp for power beyond their competence. Guardians need courage, the capacity to face danger and endure hardship without breaking. Rulers need wisdom, genuine understanding of what is good for the city as a whole, not just for themselves. Justice, Plato says, is not a fourth virtue belonging to one class. Justice is what happens when all three classes perform their proper function without interfering with each other. The farmer farms. The soldier defends. The ruler governs with knowledge. Each does what they are naturally suited for, and the city operates in harmony. Then comes the move that defines Platonic ethics. He turns the lens inward. Just as the city has three classes, the individual soul has three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Justice in the soul is the same structural relationship as justice in the city. Reason rules, spirit supports reason, and keeps appetite in check. Appetite submits to governance rather than seizing control. A just person is not someone who follows a particular set of rules. A just person is someone whose soul is properly ordered, whose inner architecture functions the way it was designed to function. Injustice is not primarily about what you do to others. It is about what has gone wrong inside you. With this framework in place, Plato can finally answer the Ring of Gyges. The shepherd who uses the ring to murder and seize power has, by Plato's account, the most disordered soul imaginable. His appetites rule. His reason serves desire instead of governing it. His spirit, rather than supporting wisdom, has become the attack dog of his cravings. Externally, he sits on a throne. Internally, he is a slave, chained to desires that multiply with every satisfaction, consumed by paranoia because he knows what invisible men are capable of. Unable to trust anyone because he has proven that trust is for fools. The tyrant is not the freest person. The tyrant is the most imprisoned. This is Plato's most elegant philosophical maneuver. He does not argue that the unjust person will eventually be caught and punished. He does not claim that the gods will settle accounts after death, though he sometimes tells myths that suggest this. He argues that injustice is its own punishment, here and now, in the texture of your inner life. The person with the ring who uses it to steal and kill has already been harmed, not by external consequence, but by the act itself, which disorders the soul the way disease disorders the body. You would not envy a person with a painless cancer just because they feel fine today. Plato asks you not to envy the successful criminal just because they appear to prosper. The argument has a beautiful internal logic, but it purchases its elegance at a cost that many readers have found too high. The most immediate objection is that Plato's concept of justice has almost nothing to do with what ordinary people mean by the word. When we say someone is just, we mean they treat others fairly, respect rights, give people what they deserve, refrain from cruelty. Plato's justice means having your soul parts in the right order. These are not the same thing. A person whose reason governs their spirit and appetite might still be a monster, might coldly and rationally exploit others, while maintaining perfect internal composure. A calculating dictator with excellent self-control would qualify as just by Plato's definition, while committing atrocities that any normal person would call unjust. The political implications press the wound further. If justice means each class staying in its assigned place, then Plato's theory sanctifies rigid hierarchy. The producer who dreams of becoming a philosopher is not ambitious. They are unjust. The guardian who questions the ruler's decisions is not exercising critical judgment. They are disrupting the harmony of the city. Social mobility becomes a form of disease. dissent becomes a symptom of disorder. Every modern commitment to equality, to the idea that a farmer's child should have the same opportunities as a ruler's child, runs directly against this vision. Karl Popper, writing in the shadow of 20th-century totalitarianism, saw Plato's Republic as one of the most dangerous books ever written. The ideal city features state control of reproduction, communal raising of children severed from their biological parents, censorship of art and literature, noble lies told to keep the lower classes compliant, and the complete elimination of private life for the ruling class. Popper recognized this architecture. He had seen it built in concrete and barbed wire across Europe. The philosopher king and the party secretary share a family resemblance. Both claim special knowledge that justifies their absolute authority over everyone else. Yet defenders of Plato argue that reading the Republic as a political blueprint misunderstands the text at the most basic level. It is a thought experiment, not a manifesto. The extreme features, communal families, noble lies, rigid castes, are not serious proposals. They are provocations designed to force the reader into thinking harder about what justice actually requires. The city is an analogy for the soul, not an architectural plan for a real society. To condemn Plato for totalitarianism on this basis is like condemning a physicist for the destruction caused by bombs because they studied the structure of the atom. The truth probably lies between these readings. Plato was not designing a state, but he was not merely playing with ideas either. The Republic expresses genuine convictions that knowledge should govern, that most people cannot be trusted with political power, that social harmony requires people accepting their natural place. These convictions have real implications, and Plato would not have spent years developing them if he thought they were only hypothetical. The text occupies an uncomfortable space between philosophy and prescription, and every reader must decide for themselves how much of Plato's vision to take seriously. What survives the criticism, though, is the force of the original question. Glaucon's challenge has never been satisfactorily answered by anyone. Why should you be just if you will never be caught? Every moral philosophy must face this test, and most quietly avoid it. Plato, at least, walked directly toward it. His answer, that injustice disorders the soul regardless of external consequences, may not be provable, but it captures something most of us recognize without being able to articulate. There is something wrong with the person who cheats without remorse, something damaged in the soul of the liar who never loses sleep. We sense that cruelty harms the cruel, that dishonesty corrodes the dishonest, even when the world rewards them. Whether this intuition can be defended philosophically or merely felt is a question Plato left open. 24 centuries later, it remains open still, and the ring is still on the table, waiting for someone honest enough to say what they would do with it. Chapter 7: The Philosopher King and the Problem of Power. 3 times Plato sailed to Syracuse. 3 times he tried to turn philosophy into power. The first visit, around 387 before the Common Era, brought him to the court of Dionysius the Elder, tyrant of the most powerful Greek city in Sicily. Plato came believing that a single ruler, properly educated, could transform a city overnight, bypassing the slow stupidity of democratic assemblies, cutting straight from wisdom to policy. Dionysius listened politely for a while, then reportedly had Plato seized and sold into slavery on the island of Aegina. Friends purchased his freedom. He went home to Athens and founded the academy. 20 years later, Dionysius the Elder died. His son, Dionysius the Younger, took power. Plato's friend Dion, the young tyrant's uncle, wrote urgently, The new ruler is malleable, intellectually curious, open to influence. This is the chance. Come back. Plato was nearly 60. He knew the risks. But the conviction that philosophy without political power is incomplete. That the thinker who refuses to engage with the world betrays the truth he claims to serve, pulled him back across the sea. The second visit was a disaster. Dionysius the Younger enjoyed philosophical conversation the way some people enjoy expensive wine, as entertainment, not transformation. He wanted to seem wise without doing the work of becoming wise. When Plato pressed harder, when the lessons moved from pleasant abstraction to uncomfortable self-examination, the tyrant grew hostile. Dion was exiled. Plato was effectively held captive in the palace for months before being allowed to leave. He went back a third time. This fact alone reveals something about Plato that the dialogues, with their careful architecture, tend to conceal: a stubbornness bordering on recklessness, a refusal to accept that theory and practice might be permanently divorced. The third visit ended worse than the second. Plato barely escaped with his life. He returned to Athens, resumed teaching at the academy, and never attempted political engagement again. He was over 70. The philosopher king remained what it had always been, a thought that the world refused to accommodate. The idea itself is stated with the force of a mathematical proof in Book 5 of the Republic. Cities will have no rest from evils, Plato declares, until philosophers become kings or kings become philosophers, until political power and philosophical wisdom meet in the same person. This is not presented as one option among many. It is presented as a necessary truth, as unavoidable as the properties of a triangle. Bad government results from ignorance. Good government requires knowledge. Only philosophers possess genuine knowledge. Therefore, only philosophers can govern well. The logic is clean. The conclusion is radical. And the problems begin the moment you try to imagine it working. The philosopher who should rule is not a professor or an intellectual or someone who has read many books. Plato describes a specific type of human being, produced by a specific educational program lasting half a century. The process begins in childhood with music and gymnastics, not to create performers or athletes, but to shape the soul's basic dispositions. Music cultivates sensitivity to harmony, proportion, and order. Gymnastics cultivates physical courage and endurance. Together they produce a temperament that is both gentle and fierce, reflective and capable of action. At 20, the most promising students begin a decade of mathematical training: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, harmonics, each discipline chosen not for practical utility, but for its power to turn the mind away from physical particulars toward abstract patterns. At 30, survivors of this long filtering process encounter dialectic, the art of questioning every assumption until only what cannot be doubted remains. But Plato issues a warning that reveals his awareness of how dangerous his own method can be. Young people exposed to dialectic too early use it as a weapon. They discover they can argue any position, undermine any belief, make any authority look foolish. They become intellectual vandals, dismantling everything and building nothing. Only those whose characters have been stabilized through 15 years of preliminary training can handle the most powerful tool of reason without being destroyed by it. At 35 comes the requirement that makes the entire system paradoxical. These brilliant philosophers, on the verge of grasping ultimate truth, must descend back into the world. They must serve as military officers and civil administrators for 15 years, dealing with logistics, conflict, human pettiness, everything philosophy promises to transcend. Plato insists on this because he understood something that pure theorists often miss. Wisdom without experience is empty. A person who understands the form of justice but has never navigated a real dispute between real people with real grievances possesses knowledge that cannot be applied. The philosopher must know both the eternal patterns and the messy particulars. Finally, at 50, those who have excelled in both contemplation and practical affairs are ready to rule. But here Plato introduces the detail that makes his system genuinely original rather than merely authoritarian. These philosopher rulers will not want to rule. Having tasted the pleasure of pure understanding, the joy of seeing how reality fits together, of grasping truths that do not decay or disappoint, they will regard political power as a burden. Governing means returning to the cave, dealing with shadows, managing conflicts between people who cannot see what the philosopher sees. The best rulers are precisely those who do not desire to rule. They govern out of duty and justice, not ambition. The moment someone wants power is the moment they become unfit to hold it. The guardians, both the philosopher rulers and the warrior class beneath them, live under conditions designed to eliminate every private interest that might corrupt their judgment. They own no property beyond bare necessities. They have no families. Children are raised communally, never knowing their biological parents. Meals are shared. Housing is shared. The entire structure of private life that makes ordinary people ordinary is abolished for the ruling class. Plato's reasoning is direct. A ruler with property will protect their wealth. A ruler with children will favor their offspring. A ruler with a comfortable home will fear losing it. Only by stripping away every personal attachment can you create a class that serves the public good without reservation. Women, remarkably, are included in this system on equal terms. Plato argues that sex is irrelevant to the capacity for wisdom and courage. Some women are naturally suited for philosophy and leadership, just as some men are. The only question is aptitude, not anatomy. In the 4th century before the Common Era, when women in Athens could not own property, vote, or appear in public without a male guardian, this was radical enough to sound insane. It remains one of the few elements of Plato's political philosophy that history has vindicated rather than condemned. But the system also requires what Plato calls noble lies, myths deliberately constructed and disseminated to maintain social order. The most famous is the myth of the metals. Citizens are told that God mixed gold into the souls of rulers, silver into guardians, and bronze or iron into producers. This myth is designed to make people accept their class position as natural and divinely ordained. Plato is completely transparent that this is a falsehood. He does not pretend it is true. He argues that it is necessary, that without such stories, the lower classes would rebel, the social hierarchy would collapse, and the city's carefully maintained harmony would disintegrate into chaos. The parallels with 20th century totalitarianism are severe enough that they cannot be explained away as coincidence or misreading. A ruling elite claiming special knowledge, state control of education and information, the elimination of family bonds for those in power, rigid class structure presented as natural order, official myths propagated to prevent dissent. Every major totalitarian regime of the modern era has exhibited these features. The Soviet Union claimed the Communist Party possessed scientific knowledge of historical laws. Nazi Germany claimed racial science justified its hierarchy. Both controlled education, weakened family structures, and manufactured foundational myths. Karl Popper saw the resemblance clearly and named Plato an enemy of the open society. the intellectual ancestor of every regime that sacrifices individual freedom on the altar of collective order. Yet the critique, however powerful, may miss what Plato was actually doing. The Republic is not a constitution. It is a thought experiment conducted at the extreme limits of political imagination. Plato pushes every idea to its logical conclusion, not because he expects anyone to implement the result, but because only at the extreme does the structure of the argument become visible. Communal families reveal the tension between private interest and public duty. Noble lies reveal the tension between truth and social stability. The philosopher king reveals the tension between knowledge and power. These are permanent tensions in every political system, not problems unique to Plato's imaginary city. By constructing a society where each tension is maximized, Plato forces us to confront them honestly, rather than pretending they do not exist. The deepest problem with the philosopher king is not that it is authoritarian. It is that it is epistemologically impossible. If genuine knowledge is as rare as Plato claims, how does anyone recognize it? The 500 citizens who condemned Socrates believed they were exercising good judgment. They were wrong. But how could they have known they were wrong, if knowing requires the very expertise they lacked? The philosopher king system demands that non-philosophers identify philosophers and hand them power. But a non-philosopher, by definition, cannot distinguish a genuine philosopher from a confident fraud. The system needs a capacity it has already declared most people do not possess. Friedrich Hayek, the economist, identified a related problem from a different angle. Even if philosopher kings were genuinely wise, they would face an insurmountable information deficit. The knowledge needed to govern a complex society is not concentrated in any single mind or group of minds. It is dispersed across millions of individuals. Farmers who know their soil, merchants who know their markets, workers who know their trades. No central authority, however brilliant, can aggregate this distributed knowledge effectively. Market prices and democratic processes, for all their messiness, perform this aggregation in ways that centralized wisdom cannot replicate. Plato's philosopher king does not just face a legitimacy problem. They face an information problem that makes wise central governance practically impossible. Modern democracies have tried, imperfectly, to absorb Plato's insight without accepting his conclusion. Constitutional constraints prevent democratic majorities from violating fundamental rights. An acknowledgement that the crowd can be wrong. Independent judiciaries interpret law based on expertise and principle, rather than popular sentiment. Central banks set monetary policy insulated from electoral pressure. Regulatory agencies staffed by specialists make technical decisions that voters are poorly equipped to evaluate. These institutions are, in a sense, Platonic elements embedded in democratic systems, pockets of expertise protected from the very populism Plato feared. But Plato would have recognized immediately that these arrangements are unstable. Populist movements routinely attack independent institutions as undemocratic. Judges are accused of overreach. Central bankers are accused of serving elites. Expertise itself is dismissed as a form of privilege. The tension between knowledge and consent, between what is wise and what is popular, has not been resolved. It has merely been managed, sometimes well and sometimes badly, through institutional design that satisfies neither the pure democrat nor the pure Platonist. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Plato identified a problem no one has solved. Democracy without wisdom is dangerous. Athens proved that by killing Socrates. Wisdom without democracy is dangerous. The 20th century proved that with every regime that claimed to know better than its citizens, the challenge remains what it was in the 4th century before the Common Era: how to create political systems that are both informed by genuine understanding and accountable to those they govern. Plato failed to solve this. We have not solved it either. The difference is that we have 2.5 millennia of catastrophic evidence showing what happens when the balance tips too far in either direction. The philosopher king sits on his throne in Plato's imagination, wise and reluctant and utterly alone. The chair beside him remains empty. No one has ever figured out who should sit in it. Chapter 8. The Ladder of Love. A group of Athenian men lie on couches after dinner, wine cups in hand, heads still aching from the previous night's drinking. Someone suggests that instead of getting drunk again, they take turns giving speeches in praise of Eros, the god of love. The setting is intimate, slightly absurd, and charged with the particular electricity of people who are clever enough to know they are performing. This is the symposium, Plato's most theatrically alive dialogue. And the evening will end with a drunken general crashing through the door and saying things about Socrates that Socrates would never say about himself. But before the chaos, before the interruption, Plato uses this unlikely stage, a dinner party, to construct one of the most ambitious theories of desire ever attempted. The early speeches are warm-ups. Phaedrus praises love as the oldest of the gods, a force that inspires courage. Lovers fight harder because they cannot bear to be seen as cowards by the beloved. Pausanias distinguishes two kinds of love: vulgar love, aimed at bodies, and heavenly love, aimed at souls. Eryximachus, a physician, extends love into a cosmic principle: harmony in music, balance in medicine, order in the seasons. Each speech adds a layer, but each remains on the surface, describing what love does without asking what love is. Then Aristophanes stands up and tells a story that has outlasted every philosophical argument in the dialogue. Once, he says, human beings were round, double creatures with 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 faces, fused back to back. They were powerful, arrogant, and they threatened the gods. Zeus, rather than destroy them, sliced each one in half like a man cutting an egg with a wire. Ever since, each severed half has wandered the earth searching for its other half. And when 2 halves find each other, they cling together with an urgency that has nothing to do with reason. Love is the name we give to this longing. We are incomplete, we know it in our bodies, and we spend our lives trying to recover a wholeness we can barely remember. The myth is so emotionally satisfying that it threatens to end the conversation. What more needs to be said? We are broken. Love heals us. But Plato, through Socrates, is about to argue that Aristophanes, for all his poetic genius, has mistaken the symptom for the disease. We are not searching for another person. We are searching for something no person can provide. Socrates does not give his own speech. He recounts what he was taught by a woman named Diotima, a priestess from Mantinea, one of the very few female voices in Plato's dialogues, and arguably the one who says the most important things. Diotima begins by dismantling the assumption that love is a god. Love cannot be a god, she argues, because gods are perfect and self-sufficient, possessing all beautiful and good things. But love is defined by wanting, by reaching for what it does not have. You do not desire what you already possess. Love is therefore not divine perfection, but the space between lack and fulfillment. A demon, an intermediate spirit, the child of poverty and resourcefulness, always hungry, always clever in pursuit of what it needs. This redefinition changes everything. Love is not a state of completion. It is a state of motion, of striving towards something that recedes as you approach. And the object of love, Diotima insists, is not beauty itself, but the permanent possession of the good. We want beautiful things because we believe they will make us happy. But happiness that comes and goes is not real happiness. We want to possess the good forever. Since we are mortal, the only way to possess anything forever is through some form of immortality. Love, at its deepest root, is the mortal creature's desperate reach toward eternity. This reach takes different forms depending on the lover's nature. The most basic form is biological procreation, creating children who carry something of you forward after you die. A higher form is cultural creation, writing poems, founding cities, establishing laws that will outlast your body. Solon's legislation, Homer's epics, these are acts of love in Plato's sense, attempts to generate something immortal from mortal material. But the highest form of love, the one Diotima saves for last, is philosophical, the generation of true understanding, the birth of wisdom in the soul rather than children in the body. Here Diotima introduces the image that has shaped Western conceptions of love for 2 millennia, the ladder of ascent. The lover begins at the bottom rung, captivated by the beauty of one particular body, a face across a room, the precise architecture of a collarbone, the way someone's hands move when they speak. This is where every love story begins, in the particular, the unrepeatable, the physical. But the philosophical lover does not stay here. With guidance, they begin to notice that the beauty in this body is the same beauty that appears in other bodies. The beloved's uniqueness starts to dissolve into a pattern. What attracted you was not this person, but something shining through this person, something that shines through many bodies equally. The next rung upward takes the lover from bodies to souls. Moral beauty, courage, generosity, intellectual honesty is more enduring and more valuable than physical beauty, which fades with age and vanishes with death. The lover who has climbed this far cares less about the beloved's appearance and more about the quality of their character. They fall in love with virtue itself, not with the body that happens to house it. From souls, the ascent moves to institutions and laws, the beauty of well-ordered societies, just constitutions, systems that enable human flourishing. Then to knowledge itself, the beauty of mathematics, of scientific understanding, of philosophical insight. Each rung is more abstract, more stable, more universal than the last. At the summit, the lover experiences what Diotima describes as a sudden vision. After years of climbing, something breaks open. The lover sees beauty itself. Not beauty in a face or a soul or a theorem, but beauty as such, eternal, unchanging, absolute. It is not beautiful in one respect and ugly in another, not beautiful to some observers and ugly to others, not beautiful at one time and ugly at another. It simply is what it is, forever. This is the form of beauty, and the one who reaches it has achieved the closest thing to immortality available to a human being. Their soul has touched something eternal, and the contact transforms them permanently. The vision is magnificent. It is also, from a certain angle, chilling. Follow the logic of the ladder and you realize what it asks you to leave behind. The person you started with, the one whose face arrested you across that room, has become dispensable. They were a rung, not a destination. The particular beloved, with their specific laugh and particular fears and unrepeatable way of being in the world, turns out to be interchangeable with any other instance of beauty. The latter teaches you to love the universal by letting go of the individual. And this is precisely the place where many readers, ancient and modern, have refused to follow Plato upward. Martha Nussbaum, the contemporary philosopher, has argued that the ladder of love represents not wisdom, but a flight from the vulnerability that makes love meaningful. What makes love love is precisely that it cannot be transferred, that this person matters in a way that cannot be replaced by another equally beautiful person. Love involves risk, dependence, the possibility of devastating loss. Plato's ladder promises to eliminate that risk by teaching us to love something that cannot die, cannot betray, cannot disappoint. But in eliminating the risk, it eliminates the love. What remains at the summit, the solitary contemplation of an abstract form, may be many things, but it is not what any human being has ever meant by the word love. The subordination of physical desire to spiritual aspiration also carries consequences that rippled through centuries of Western culture. If bodily attraction is merely the confused first step toward a truth that transcends the body, then the body itself becomes something to overcome. Desire becomes a weakness to be disciplined, rather than a capacity to be celebrated. This body-denying strand of Platonism entered Christian theology through Augustine, who read the Symposium before he read Paul, and it contributed to centuries of guilt, repression, and suspicion directed at physical intimacy. The celibate monk and the philosophical ascetic share a common ancestor in Diotima's ladder, the conviction that the flesh distracts from the truly real. Yet there is psychological acuity in Plato's analysis that survives every objection. He understood that desire is never simply about its apparent object. The person consumed by infatuation is not responding to who the beloved actually is, but to something they project onto the beloved, an image of completeness, of meaning, of rescue from the ordinary. Modern psychoanalysis would call this transference or idealization. Plato called it a confused recognition of the form of beauty, glimpsed imperfectly in a physical body. The terminology differs. The observation is the same. We fall in love not with people, but with what we believe people represent. And what they represent, if you press hard enough, is something no individual person can embody fully. Wholeness, permanence, the end of longing. The Symposium does not end with Diotima's speech. It ends with disruption. Alcibiades, the most beautiful, most brilliant, most dangerous man in Athens, crashes through the door, drunk, wreathed in ribbons, supported by a flute girl. He does not give a speech praising love. He gives a speech praising Socrates, and it is one of the most psychologically complex passages in ancient literature. He describes Socrates as a man who looks like a satyr on the outside, but contains golden statues of the gods within. He confesses that Socrates is the only person who has ever made him feel ashamed, the only person whose words reach the part of him that knows he is living badly. He describes attempting to seduce Socrates, lying beside him all night, offering his young beauty in exchange for wisdom, and Socrates' absolute indifference to the offer. Alcibiades has met the philosopher who ascended the ladder, and the encounter did not transform him. He recognized Socrates' greatness and could not be changed by it. He went on to betray Athens, defect to Sparta, defect again to Persia, and die in exile, one of the most gifted and most destructive figures in Greek history. His presence at the end of the Symposium is Plato's admission that philosophy's power to transform has limits. Not every soul can climb the ladder. Not every encounter with wisdom leads to conversion. Some people see the light clearly, turn away, and walk back into the cave by choice. The connection between love and mortality may be Plato's deepest insight in the entire dialogue. We love because we are going to die. If we were immortal, complete, self-sufficient, eternal, we would have no need to reach beyond ourselves. Love is the signature of finitude, the specific ache of creatures who can imagine forever but cannot stay. Every act of love, from the most physical to the most philosophical, is an attempt to cheat death, to create something that outlasts the body, to touch something that does not end when we do. Whether that something is a child, a poem, a mathematical proof, or the form of beauty itself, the motive is the same. We are mortal, and we cannot bear it. Love is how we refuse to accept the terms. Perhaps the deepest question the symposium raises is whether the ladder must be climbed all the way to the top. Plato says yes. Anything short of the form of beauty is an incomplete love, a settling for shadows. But there is another possibility he does not consider, or considers and rejects. Perhaps the particular beloved is not a rung to be left behind, but the place where the universal becomes visible. Perhaps you do not need to abandon the face across the room to see eternity. Perhaps eternity is what you see when you look at that face long enough, honestly enough, with enough willingness to be undone by what you find there. Plato climbed past the particular toward the universal. But the particular, stubbornly and beautifully, keeps calling us back. Chapter 9. The Ancient Quarrel with Poetry. Here is the paradox that has troubled readers for 24 centuries. The man who wrote the allegory of the cave, one of the most luminous pieces of literary imagination in any language, is the same man who argued that poets should be expelled from the city. The philosopher who crafted Socrates' death scene with the emotional precision of a master dramatist is the same philosopher who claimed that dramatic art corrupts the soul. Plato used metaphor, myth, dialogue, and narrative with a skill that most poets would envy. And then he turned around and said that what he was doing was dangerous, that people who do it well should be regarded with suspicion, and that a just society would either silence them or put them on a very short leash. This is not a minor inconsistency buried in a footnote. It is a sustained argument occupying significant portions of the Republic, reinforced in the Ion, the Gorgias, and the Phaedrus. Plato meant it. Understanding why requires grasping not just his theory of art, but the fear that drives it. A fear rooted in the recognition that stories are more powerful than arguments, and that this power, precisely because it bypasses reason, is almost impossible to control. The first charge against poetry is metaphysical, and it follows directly from the theory of forms. A carpenter who builds a bed looks to the form of bed and produces a physical object, already one step removed from true reality. A painter who paints the bed copies the physical object, producing an image of a copy, 2 steps removed. The poet who describes the bed in verse creates yet another layer of imitation, a shadow of a shadow of a shadow. At each remove, we drift further from truth and closer to illusion. The poet, far from being wise, operates at the lowest level of Plato's divided line, the realm of images and conjecture, where appearance has completely replaced reality. But the charge cuts deeper than mere distance from the forms. Plato argues that poets do not understand what they depict. Homer writes about war without being a general, about navigation without being a sailor, about governance without being a ruler. If Homer truly understood military strategy, he would have led armies. If he truly understood politics, he would have founded cities and written constitutions. That he remained a poet, producing beautiful words about subjects he had never mastered, proves that poetry is a kind of inspired ignorance. The poet creates the appearance of knowledge without possessing the substance. And because the appearance is beautiful, audiences mistake it for the real thing. The second charge is psychological, and it is the one that reveals what Plato truly fears. Poetry works by engaging the emotions. Tragedy shows heroes overwhelmed by grief, rage, desire, and the audience identifies with them. You watch Achilles weeping over Patroclus, and something inside you weeps with him. You watch Oedipus discovering the truth of his origin, and something inside you shares his horror. This identification, Plato argues, strengthens the lower parts of the soul, spirit and appetite, at reason's expense. In daily life, a good person controls their grief, restrains their anger, moderates their desires. But in the theater, these same emotions are indulged and celebrated. The audience practices losing control in a space that rewards the loss. And what you practice, you become. Even comedy is dangerous, though, in a different way. When you laugh at cruelty on stage, at vulgarity, at characters behaving shamefully, you are training yourself to find acceptable what your reason would condemn. A split opens in the soul between what you judge to be wrong and what you enjoy watching. The soul becomes divided against itself, its rational judgments undermined by its aesthetic pleasures. Over time, the pleasure wins. The person who laughs at dishonesty on stage becomes slightly more tolerant of dishonesty in life. The corruption is incremental, almost invisible, which makes it more dangerous than obvious vice. The third charge is about power, the power of beauty to override judgment. Poetry does not persuade through argument. It enchants. It casts a kind of spell, using rhythm, image, and emotional resonance to bypass the rational mind entirely. You can know intellectually that a tragic hero should control himself, yet still cry at his suffering. You can know that glorifying violence is wrong, yet still thrill at the battle scene. This is not a failure of the audience's character. It is the nature of the medium. Poetry is designed to move, and what moves people is not always what is good for them. The pastry chef gives pleasure, the doctor gives health. The poet, like the pastry chef, aims at gratification. And a civilization that mistakes gratification for nourishment will sicken without understanding why. Plato extends the same analysis to rhetoric, the art of persuasion that dominated Athenian public life. In the Gorgias, he argues that most rhetoric is flattery disguised as expertise. The skilled orator makes weak arguments appear strong, makes injustice appear just, makes foolishness appear wise. Rhetoric is to justice what cosmetics are to genuine health, a surface that imitates the real thing convincingly enough that most people cannot tell the difference. In a democracy, where policy is determined by whoever speaks most persuasively, this is catastrophic. The city is governed not by those who understand what is good, but by those who are best at making things sound good. Truth becomes irrelevant. Persuasion is everything. The connection to our present moment is almost too obvious to state, but Plato would insist on stating it anyway. An algorithm that selects content based on emotional engagement rather than accuracy is performing exactly the function Plato attributed to the corrupt poet, strengthening appetite and weakening reason, giving people what feels good rather than what is true. A political advertisement that uses music, imagery, and narrative to create an emotional response is doing what Plato said rhetoric does, bypassing rational evaluation to implant a conclusion the viewer never consciously chose. A social media platform optimized for outrage is the Athenian theater scaled to billions, training its audience to react rather than reflect, to feel rather than think. Plato did not have the vocabulary of information warfare. He did not need it. He had seen the mechanism clearly enough in his own century. But here the paradox reasserts itself with full force. Plato's own dialogues use every technique he condemns. The allegory of the cave is not an argument. It is a story, an image, a piece of literary art designed to move the reader emotionally before they have time to evaluate its logical structure. The death of Socrates in the Phaedo is crafted for maximum emotional impact. The hemlock working upward through the body, the friends weeping, the final words about owing a rooster to Asclepius. The symposium is a dramatic masterpiece, complete with character development, comic timing, and a drunken interruption that functions like a fifth act. Plato does not just use poetic techniques. He uses them brilliantly. And he knows he uses them brilliantly. One resolution of the quarrel paradox is that Plato distinguishes between art in service of truth and art in service of illusion. His dialogues use literary technique as a vehicle for philosophical insight. The emotional impact is not an end in itself, but a means of drawing the reader toward genuine understanding. The myths he tells, the cave, the chariot, the myth of are explicitly offered as likely stories, approximations of truths that cannot be captured in pure argument. This is philosophical art, subordinated to wisdom rather than competing with it. The problem is not beauty or emotion as such. The problem is beauty and emotion detached from truth, operating independently, creating convictions that reason has not examined. Aristotle, Plato's own student, offered the most enduring response. In the Poetics, he argues that poetry is not the enemy of truth, but its ally. Tragedy does not corrupt through emotional indulgence. It purifies through catharsis. By experiencing pity and fear in the controlled environment of the theater, audiences process these emotions safely, emerging more emotionally balanced rather than less. Poetry is more philosophical than history, Aristotle insists, because history records what happened to particular people in particular circumstances, while poetry depicts what could happen to people of a certain kind, universal patterns of human nature visible only through the lens of fiction. The poet grasps something the historian misses, something closer to the forms Plato values, expressed in the only medium that can make universals felt rather than merely thought. The question of whether art requires knowledge has never been settled. Plato says no. The poet imitates appearances without understanding reality. But we recognize that certain novels teach us more about human nature than any psychology textbook, that certain films reveal moral complexity, that philosophical treatises flatten into abstraction, that certain songs articulate emotions we could not name until we heard them. This is not knowledge in Plato's sense. It cannot be stated as a proposition, defended with an argument, derived from first principles. But it may be knowledge nonetheless, a different kind, operating through different channels, reaching parts of the mind that dialectic cannot touch. The censorship Plato advocates remains the point where most modern readers refuse to follow him. A city where philosopher kings decide which stories can be told, which songs can be sung, which images can be shown. This is not a society most of us would choose to inhabit. We have seen what happens when states control art. The result is not moral improvement, but propaganda, the replacement of complex truth with simplified messaging that serves the interests of those in power. Plato would respond that his philosopher rulers, unlike political tyrants, actually know the truth and would censor only what is genuinely harmful. But this brings us back to the recognition problem. Who certifies the censors? Who watches the watchers? The person with the power to silence art is the person most likely to silence the art that threatens their power. Yet Plato's warning about art's influence on character cannot be entirely dismissed. We do absorb values from the stories we consume. Children who watch thousands of hours of entertainment absorb its assumptions about what is normal, desirable, admirable. Cultures that glorify violence in their entertainment do not produce less violence through catharsis. the evidence is, at best, mixed. Advertising works precisely because images and narratives shape desires below the threshold of rational evaluation. Plato saw this power clearly. His error was not in diagnosing the problem, but in proposing a cure, centralized censorship, that creates worse pathologies than the disease it treats. The ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, as Plato called it, is not a historical curiosity. It is the tension between two ways of reaching truth, one through argument, evidence, and logical structure, the other through image, emotion, and narrative force. Philosophy wants to climb from particulars to universals, to state truths clearly enough that they can be tested. Poetry wants to embed universals in particulars vivid enough that they can be felt. Each mode captures something the other misses. Each is dangerous without the other. Philosophy without poetry becomes arid, disconnected from the lived texture of human experience. Poetry without philosophy becomes manipulative, moving people toward conclusions that cannot survive examination. Plato himself is the proof that the quarrel cannot be resolved by choosing sides. His greatest philosophical insights are delivered through his greatest literary achievements. The cave, the ladder of love, the allegory of the chariot. These are not arguments decorated with images. They are images that think. Remove the poetry from Plato, and you do not get purer philosophy. You get a textbook no one would remember. He needed what he feared. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the ancient quarrel, that the most dangerous powers are also the most necessary ones, and that the mind that tries to live without imagination does not become more rational but less human. Chapter 10. The philosopher questions himself. Picture a man in his 60s, walking the grounds of the school he built. He has spent 30 years constructing one of the most comprehensive philosophical systems in human history, a theory of reality, of knowledge, of justice, of the soul, of love, of education, of the cosmos. Students come from across the Greek world to study with him. His dialogues circulate in copies. His ideas have become the intellectual architecture of an entire generation. And now, in the quiet of his later years, he sits down and writes a dialogue in which an elderly philosopher systematically dismantles the theory on which everything else rests. The elderly philosopher wins the argument. The young defender of the forms, a character named Socrates, has no adequate response. Plato does not rescue his own theory. He lets it bleed. The dialogue is the Parmenides, and it is one of the most extraordinary acts of intellectual honesty in the history of thought. Philosophers do not typically attack their own central doctrines. They refine them, qualify them, defend them against critics with increasing ingenuity. What they almost never do is stage a public execution of their own best idea and leave the body unburied. Yet this is precisely what Plato does. The young Socrates presents the theory of forms, the claim that behind every class of particular things exists an eternal, perfect, unchanging form that gives them their identity. The elderly Parmenides listens carefully. Then he begins asking questions. The first strike is the third man argument, and it is lethal. If multiple particular things, say, multiple large things, are large because they participate in the form of largeness, then there is something that all the large things and the form of largeness itself have in common. But if that commonality must be explained by a further form, and that further form shares something with the things it explains, we need yet another form, and another, spiraling upward without end. The theory that was supposed to ground all explanation generates an infinite regress. Every answer demands another answer. The foundation has no floor. The second strike targets the participation relation itself, the very mechanism that connects forms to the physical world. If a form is wholly present in each thing that participates in it, then the form is in many places at once, divided among its instances, and therefore no longer one. But if only a part of the form is present in each thing, then the form has parts and is no longer simple and indivisible. The form of smallness, for instance, would have to give a part of itself to each small thing. But a part of smallness is smaller than smallness itself, which means each small thing would be small by virtue of something smaller than the small, which makes no sense at all. The relationship between forms and particulars, which the entire theory depends upon, dissolves under examination into metaphor and confusion. Then comes what scholars call the separation problem, and it may be the most devastating of all. If forms exist in a completely separate realm, cut off from the physical world, then they cannot interact with physical things. They cannot cause them, shape them, influence them in any way. Causation requires contact of some kind. If not physical, then at least relational. But Plato's forms are defined precisely by their separation from the world of becoming. They are eternal, the world is temporal. They are perfect, the world is imperfect. They are unchanging. The world is in constant flux. The gap between the two realms is not a distance that could be crossed. It is a difference in kind that makes any connection unintelligible. The forms were supposed to explain the physical world, but their very nature makes explanation impossible. The young Socrates in the dialogue cannot answer these objections. He tries. He offers the familiar responses. Forms are patterns that things resemble. Things participate in forms the way copies relate to originals. Parmenides shows that each response generates the same problems in a different grammar form. Resemblance is symmetrical. If the particular resembles the form resembles the particular, and we need a third entity to explain the resemblance, triggering the same regress. Participation remains undefined, a word that gestures toward a relationship without specifying what that relationship actually is. Every exit from the labyrinth leads back to the center. What makes this dialogue so unusual is not the quality of the objections. Aristotle had raised similar concerns, and later critics would raise more. What makes it unique is the author. These are not external attacks on Plato's philosophy. They are internal ones, crafted by the same mind that built the theory, delivered with the precision of someone who knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are and exactly how much pressure they can take. Plato is not defending his system. He is stress-testing it to failure, and he publishes the results. Scholars have debated for centuries what this means. Some argue that Plato had genuinely lost confidence in the theory of forms and was signaling its abandonment, that the later dialogues represent a fundamental break with his earlier metaphysics. Others argue the opposite, that the Parmenides is a pedagogical exercise designed to train advanced students in dialectical reasoning by presenting problems they must solve for themselves. The dialogue does not solve the problems because solving them is the reader's task. Still others take a middle position. Plato recognized serious difficulties in the theory and was revising it, not abandoning it, moving toward a more sophisticated understanding of how forms relate to particulars and to each other. The later dialogues support the revision reading more than the abandonment reading, but the revisions are radical enough to feel like a different philosophy. In the Sophist, Plato tackles a problem that had haunted Greek thought since Parmenides himself, the problem of non-being. How can we speak of what is not? A false statement seems to say something about what does not exist. But if non-being is nothing, We cannot refer to it, think about it, or say anything about it at all. This would make falsehood impossible. Every statement would be either true or meaningless. Plato's solution is elegant and technically demanding. Non-being is not absolute nothingness. It is difference. To say something is not beautiful is not to say it participates in nothingness, but to say it is different from what is beautiful. This reinterpretation rescues the possibility of false statements and opens the way for a much richer understanding of how forms relate. Not as isolated entities in splendid independence, but as a network of connections, each form defined partly by its relations to others, some forms blending with others, some excluding others. The Theaetetus takes up the question of knowledge with a humility absent from the Republic's confident epistemology. 3 definitions of knowledge are proposed and refuted. Knowledge as perception, knowledge as true belief, knowledge as true belief with an account. None survives examination. The dialogue ends in aporia, with Socrates confessing that they have not found what they were looking for. Compare this with the divided line and the allegory of the cave, where the path from ignorance to knowledge seemed clear if difficult. In the Theaetetus, the path itself has become uncertain. Plato the system builder has become Plato the questioner, and the questions no longer have ready answers. The Philebus addresses the relationship between pleasure and knowledge in the good life. Earlier dialogues, particularly the Gorgias and parts of the Republic, draw a sharp line between philosophical life and the life of pleasure, as if the two were fundamentally opposed, as if choosing wisdom meant renouncing enjoyment. The Philebus retreats from this severity. The best life, Plato now argues, is a mixture of both. Pure intellect without any pleasure would be inhuman, a cold, disembodied existence that no actual person could sustain. Pure pleasure without reason would be subhuman. An animal's life of stimulus and response, without understanding or meaning. The good life requires measure, proportion, the right blend of thinking and feeling. This is a more mature position, less dramatic perhaps than the earlier asceticism, but more honest about what embodied creatures actually need. And then there is the Laws, Plato's longest work, almost certainly his last, written without Socrates as a character. It replaces the philosopher king with a detailed legal code. It abandons communal families and the abolition of private property. It introduces traditional religion as a stabilizing social force. In almost every respect, it retreats from the radical idealism of the Republic towards something more practical, more cautious, more achievable. But the retreat carries its own darkness. The Laws prescribes how citizens should live in granular detail, what they should sing, how they should dance, what they should believe about the gods. Atheism is a crime punishable by imprisonment and, for repeat offenders, death. A council of elderly guardians surveils the population to ensure compliance. If the Republic was an impossible dream, the Laws is a suffocating reality. A society where order has been purchased at the cost of everything that makes life worth ordering. The movement from Republic to Laws traces an arc that many idealists have followed, from utopian vision to pragmatic compromise, from the belief that human nature can be perfected to the conviction that it can only be managed. The young Plato believed a philosopher could educate a tyrant and transform a city. The old Plato, back from Syracuse with his illusions stripped away, believed that the best you could hope for was a good set of laws enforced with sufficient rigor. The trajectory is sobering. It suggests that sustained engagement with reality, with actual human beings in actual political situations, erodes idealism not because the ideal was wrong, but because the material it must work with resists the shape the ideal demands. The seventh letter, if genuinely written by Plato, adds a final unsettling layer. In it, he claims that the most important philosophical truths cannot be written down at all. They can only be grasped through prolonged personal interaction, years of living and thinking together, in the kind of sustained intellectual intimacy the Academy provided. Written works, including his own dialogues, are preliminary exercises at best. The real teaching happened in conversation, in the unrecorded exchanges between teacher and student, in the flicker of understanding that passes between two minds working at their limits. If this is true, then everything we have, 36 dialogues, the most influential body of philosophical writing in Western history, is the outer shell of a teaching whose core has been lost. We are reading the notes, not hearing the music. Perhaps this is why the later dialogues feel less certain, less architecturally complete than the earlier ones. The confidence of the Republic gives way to the questioning of the Theaetetus, the self-critique of the Parmenides, the compromise of the laws. But this loss of confidence is not a failure. It is the most honest thing Plato ever did. To build a system is impressive. To interrogate your own system with the same rigor you applied to everyone else's, that is rare. To publish the interrogation, knowing it might undermine everything you have taught, that requires a commitment to truth that exceeds the commitment to being right. The later Plato teaches something the earlier Plato could not, that philosophical progress is not a straight line from ignorance to knowledge, but a spiral that circles back over the same ground at greater depth. Questions you thought you had answered reopen. Solutions you thought were solid reveal hidden fractures. What you knew at 30 looks different at 60, not because you were wrong before, necessarily, but because you have learned to see complications that confidence once obscured. This is not decline. This is the shape of genuine thinking, which is always unfinished, always revising, always finding in yesterday's certainty today's problem. The ultimate lesson of Plato's self-criticism may be the most Socratic thing about him. Socrates said the wisest person is the one who knows they do not know. Plato, in his later years, demonstrated what that looks like in practice. He turned the dialectical method, the weapon he had used against every interlocutor, every rival, every comfortable assumption, back upon himself. He found that his own foundations were less secure than he had believed, and instead of concealing this discovery, he shared it, leaving us not a finished system, but an open conversation. The greatest philosopher in Western history ended his career not with answers, but with better questions. That may be the most important thing he ever taught. Chapter 11. The Shadow That Became the Light. Alfred North Whitehead, a mathematician who turned philosopher in his 60s, once made a claim so extravagant it should have been dismissed as flattery. The entire Western philosophical tradition, he said, consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. The statement has been quoted so often, it has become furniture. Something people repeat without examining. But sit with it for a moment and notice what it actually says. Not that Plato was right about everything. Not that his answers were final. That his questions were. That every serious thinker who came after him, whether they knew it or not, was responding to problems he had identified, using categories he had shaped, arguing within a space he had opened. 24 centuries of philosophy, theology, science, political theory, and art, all of it a conversation with a man who has been dead since roughly 347 before the Common Era. his first and most brilliant interlocutor, was the student who disagreed with him most completely. Aristotle spent 20 years at the academy, absorbing Plato's framework, and then spent the rest of his life methodically dismantling it. He rejected the separate realm of forms. Universals exist in particular things, not above them. He rejected the epistemology of recollection. Knowledge begins with sensory experience, not with prenatal memories. He rejected the philosopher king. Practical wisdom belongs to experienced citizens, not to contemplative elites detached from ordinary life. Yet every position Aristotle staked out was a position defined by opposition to Plato. Even in rebellion, he could not escape the gravitational field. He was arguing against Plato, but he was arguing about Plato's questions, in Plato's terms, on Plato's ground. The escape was an illusion. The footnote had begun. 3 centuries later, Plotinus took Plato's philosophy and set it on fire, not to destroy it, but to transform it into something incandescent. The form of the good became the one, an ineffable principle beyond all description, the source from which all reality emanates the way light radiates from a flame. The soul's ascent toward the forms became a mystical passage toward union with the divine. Philosophy became spiritual practice. Contemplation became prayer. Plotinus claimed he was merely interpreting Plato. He was, in fact, creating Neoplatonism, a philosophical religion that would reshape the ancient world's understanding of the relationship between the human and the transcendent. The system bore Plato's name. The content had been transformed into something Plato might not have recognized and almost certainly would have questioned. But it was through Christianity that Plato's influence became truly inescapable. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, confessed that reading Plato, or rather, reading Plotinus reading Plato, prepared his mind for the Christian revelation. The conversion was not from paganism to faith. It was from one form of Platonism to another. The eternal forms became ideas in the mind of God. The demiurge of the Timaeus became the Christian creator, though now creating from nothing rather than shaping pre-existing matter. The immortal soul became the soul awaiting judgment and resurrection. The split between the visible world of becoming and the intelligible world of being mapped onto the split between the earthly city and the city of God. Augustine baptized Plato, and the baptism held for over 1,000 years. The consequences were profound and not entirely benign. Plato's suspicion of the body, the doctrine that the soul is imprisoned in flesh, that physical desire distracts from eternal truth, that philosophy is the practice of dying, entered Christian theology and metastasized. Celibacy became a higher calling than marriage. Physical pleasure became suspect. The natural world, rather than being celebrated as creation's gift, became a temptation to be resisted on the way to a purely spiritual destination. Centuries of guilt about sexuality, centuries of hostility toward the body, centuries of treating earthly life as a mere waiting room for eternity. These are not direct consequences of anything Plato wrote, but they grew in soil he had prepared. The philosopher who loved beauty and wrote the Symposium's ecstatic praise of desire became, through layers of interpretation and misinterpretation, a patron saint of asceticism. The Renaissance recovery of Plato's actual texts, translated directly from Greek by Marsilio Ficino in 15th century Florence, revealed how much the medieval tradition had added, subtracted, and distorted. Ficino and his circle read the Symposium and found not a call to renounce the body but a celebration of beauty and creative love. They read the dialogues and found not a dogmatic system but an open conversation, playful, ironic, alive with dramatic energy. Renaissance Platonism emphasized human potential rather than human sinfulness, the beauty of the physical world as a reflection of divine beauty, the artist as someone who participates in the creative power of the divine craftsman. This was a Platonism that Botticelli could paint and Michelangelo could sculpt, sensuous, humanistic. In love with the world it was supposed to transcend. Modern philosophy defined itself against Plato with the energy of an adolescent rejecting a parent. John Locke denied innate ideas. The mind at birth is a blank slate, and all knowledge comes from experience. David Hume pushed empiricism further, arguing that even causation is not something we know through reason, but something we infer from habit. The scientific revolution replaced teleological explanation, the question of what things are for, with mechanical causation, the question of what made them happen. The cosmos was no longer a living being crafted by a rational demiurge, but a machine operating according to blind laws. Darwin removed the last trace of design from biology. The physical world Plato had called a shadow turned out to be the only world there was. Yet Plato kept returning, like a thought you cannot quite suppress. Descartes, who claimed to start philosophy from scratch with his method of radical doubt, ended up with a dualism of mind and body that mirrors Plato's dualism of soul and form. Kant, who never read Plato in the original, reinvented the distinction between the world as it appears to us and the world as it is in itself. Phenomena and noumena, the visible and the intelligible, the cave and the sunlight, restated in 18th century German. Even the materialists who denied everything Plato stood for could not escape his framework. They were still asking his questions. What is real? What can we know? How should we live? And defining their answers by opposition to his. Nietzsche understood this entrapment more clearly than anyone. He diagnosed Platonism as the original sin of Western civilization, the moment when philosophy turned against life, against the body, against the earth, in favor of a fictional higher world that drained meaning from the only world we actually inhabit. Christianity, he declared, is Platonism for the people, the same metaphysical structure made accessible to the masses through myth and ritual. To overcome nihilism, the West must overcome Plato. But Nietzsche's own philosophy, with its emphasis on eternal recurrence, on the will to power as a cosmic principle, on the philosopher as a legislator of values, remains structured by the very Platonism it attacks. He could not escape the shadow. No one can. To argue against Plato is still to argue with Plato, and to argue with Plato is to remain within the space he created. The 20th century saw Plato attacked from every direction simultaneously. Logical positivists dismissed the forms as meaningless metaphysical speculation. Ordinary language philosophers argued that philosophical problems dissolve when we pay attention to how words actually function. Karl Popper named Plato an enemy of the open society. Feminists criticized his association of reason with masculinity and matter with femininity. Postmodernists rejected the very idea of objective truth that Plato's entire system depends upon. By the end of the century, it seemed as though nothing was left. Every pillar had been pulled down, every wall demolished, every foundation exposed and found wanting. And yet, the mathematician Kurt Gödel, one of the most rigorous logicians who ever lived, was an unapologetic Platonist about mathematical objects. Numbers exist, he insisted. They are not human inventions. They are discovered, not created. Many working mathematicians share this intuition, that when they prove a theorem, they are uncovering a truth that was there before them and will remain after them. In moral philosophy, The revival of virtue ethics by thinkers like Philippa Foot and Alastair MacIntyre returned to fundamentally Platonic questions. How should we live? What character should we cultivate? What does human flourishing require? They rejected Plato's metaphysics, but accepted his framework. That ethics is about the whole person, not just isolated actions, and that some ways of living are objectively better than others. In cognitive science, the discovery that human categorization operates through prototypes, idealized mental representations against which particular instances are measured, echoes the structure of the forms with uncanny precision. The vocabulary has changed, the architecture persists. In political philosophy, Plato's challenge to democracy has proven impossible to dismiss, however uncomfortable it makes us. John Rawls, constructing his theory of justice from behind a veil of ignorance, was attempting exactly what Plato attempted: to show that justice is rational, that it serves the interests of everyone, that it can be derived from principles no reasonable person would reject. The method is different. The ambition is identical, and the unresolved tension between expertise and democratic participation, between the wisdom Plato demanded and the consent democracy requires, continues to structure debates about technocracy, constitutional design, and the role of institutions in a populist age. Perhaps the most surprising resurrection of Platonic thinking has occurred in physics. The laws of nature, mathematical equations that govern everything from quantum particles to galaxy clusters, appear to exist independently of the physical universe they describe. They were true before any mind formulated them. They would remain true if the universe ceased to exist. When physicists speak of discovering laws rather than inventing them, when they marvel at the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in describing physical reality, they are expressing a Platonism so deep it has become invisible. The forms have been renamed. The intuition that mathematical truth transcends the physical world has not changed since Plato inscribed his warning above the Academy's door. The dark legacy cannot be separated from the light. Plato's devaluation of the physical world contributed to environmental indifference. If nature is mere appearance, why protect it? His rigid social hierarchy provided intellectual cover for systems of oppression, from feudalism to fascism. His epistemological elitism nurtured contempt for ordinary people and their capacity for judgment. His hostility to democracy, however well-reasoned, has been weaponized by every authoritarian who needed a philosophical pedigree. These are not misreadings or distortions. They are consequences, sometimes intended, sometimes not, of ideas that Plato held with genuine conviction. To take him seriously means taking the damage seriously too. But to abandon him is impossible, and would be unwise even if it were possible. He taught us that truth exists independently of what we wish were true, that reality does not bend to accommodate our preferences, our politics, or our comfort. He taught us that justice is not merely whatever the powerful call just, that there are standards beyond human convention by which our actions and our institutions can be measured and found wanting. He taught us that the unexamined life is not worth living, that asking difficult questions about how we should live is not a luxury or an academic exercise, but the most practical thing a human being can do. He taught us that education should transform, not merely inform, that its purpose is not to fill minds with facts, but to turn souls toward the light. These are not footnotes. These are foundations, and they hold weight even now, even after 24 centuries of erosion, even after everything we have learned that Plato did not know. even after every critique that has been leveled at his system. The forms may not exist in a separate realm. The soul may not be immortal. The philosopher king may be a dangerous fantasy. But the conviction that truth matters, that justice is real, that the mind can reach beyond the senses toward something the senses cannot touch. This conviction, in all its fragility and all its stubbornness, is Plato's gift. We did not earn it, we inherited it, and we cannot return it, because it has become indistinguishable from the way we think. Ending. We are finite creatures haunted by the infinite. We live in time but can imagine eternity. We see shadows but insist there must be light. We know we will die but build as though we will not. This tension between what we are and what we reach for is the space where philosophy lives. Plato did not invent the tension. He named it. He mapped it. He made it impossible to ignore. And every generation since has returned to his maps, not because they are complete, but because no one has drawn better ones. If something here made the ordinary world look slightly different, if the chair across the room seems less solid than it did an hour ago, or the word justice feels heavier on your tongue, stay. There is more coming. One question to carry with you. Tonight, when the room goes dark and the screen goes black, and you are left alone with whatever you call yourself, ask this. If everything you see is a shadow, and the light that casts it is something you have never directly faced, what would it cost you to turn around? Plato never promised you would like what you find. He only promised it would be real.